In the shadows of forgotten wars lie fragments too dangerous to display. Fragments buried in sealed vaults, burned from ledgers, erased from the tongues of men who once carried them. Whispered through coded signals and half-burned dossiers, these truths linger like smoke in locked corridors of power. What remains are the echoes, vanished fleets, unmarked graves, sealed crates in frozen tundra. Each fragment draws us deeper into a silence deliberately woven, where the line between knowledge and secrecy collapses. In the closing weeks of the Second World War, as Berlin crumbled under the relentless artillery of the Red Army, a series of desperate measures were initiated by the surviving command of the Kriegsmarine. Among the most obscure of these final operations was an effort codenamed Seawolf the Sow, a convoy that allegedly departed from Kiel on the night of 23rd April 1945. The records that survive are fragmentary, contradictory, and in many cases deliberately altered, but scattered evidence points to a mission unlike any other undertaken by the collapsing Reich. At its heart was a fleet of 6 Type 21's Electroboat, the most advanced submarines Germany had constructed, accompanied by 2 supply vessels and escorted by elements of the 33rd U-boat flotilla. Standard histories note only that Seawolf was the name of a submarine wolf pack destroyed in April 1945 by US Navy hunter-killer groups in the North Atlantic. Yet within Admiralty war diaries, dated 28 April, appear references to additional units believed en route from Kiel to unknown destination, convoy strength not confirmed. The notation is struck through in red pencil and never again referenced in official after-action reports. Curiously, signals intelligence from Bletchley Park reveals that an intercept of Enigma traffic on 24th of April carried the phrase Schattenladung, shadow cargo, and an order for silence across all U-boat channels. This was followed by a complete blackout of wireless activity from several stations that had been highly active only days earlier. Survivor testimony is rare. In 1952, a debriefing of former Oberleutnant zur See Hans-Peter Dreschler, preserved in US Army counterintelligence, Course Files, makes a fleeting reference to the Kiel flotilla that never returned. He described crates marked with the Reichsministerium für Bewaffnung und Munition insignia, guarded by a detachment of SS Obersturmbannführer Ernst Riemann's men, loaded onto the supply ship Regenbogen under heavy secrecy. Dreschler recalled seeing not only canisters resembling uranium oxide transport containers, but also what he believed to be bulky radar equipment, covered in tarpaulin and stamped with high-voltage warnings. According to his account, officers were instructed that the material was bound for a neutral port, though no destination was specified. Officially, Allied navies claimed success against all remaining German attempts to flee Europe by sea, but examination of US Navy records, specifically Task Force 22.3 reports from April 1945, shows that while 5 contacts were prosecuted near the Azores, no wreckage or bodies were recovered. British Admiralty memos circulated in early May reference only the complete disappearance of suspected flotilla units, a phrasing that suggests uncertainty rather than confirmed destruction. Despite extensive post-war searches, no wrecks corresponding to the missing vessels have been definitively located on the seabed. OSS cables, preserved in partially declassified files from 1946, suggest that American intelligence was aware of rumors linking the flotilla's disappearance to South America. One memorandum from Bern Station, dated 12th July 1945, notes, "Source indicates German naval presence expected at Argentine coastal point, possibly Mar del Plata. Cargo described as technical, nuclear in nature. Verification impossible." Though the authenticity of this report has been questioned, the US Navy maintained a heightened patrol presence off the Argentine coast throughout that summer. Not a single submarine surrender was logged that corresponded to the supposed Kiel convoy. The Soviets were not blind to these mysteries. NKVD archives, glimpsed only in fragments by Western historians, describe interrogations of German naval personnel captured in Danzig in May 1945. Among them was a sailor who insisted that U-boats with valuable cargo sailed west and vanished into the sea fog. The Soviets believed the cargo to be linked to Germany's nuclear weapons program, which had left behind scattered traces in laboratories at Haigerloch and Stadtilm. While mainstream accounts dismissed Germany's atomic efforts as incomplete, Soviet military intelligence insisted until the 1950s that German material had reached foreign hands, accelerating Allied and perhaps even South American nuclear development. The most troubling evidence comes not from the war years, but from anomalies uncovered decades later. In 1984, Norwegian trawlers netted metallic debris off the coast of Iceland, later analyzed by maritime archaeologists. Among the fragments were pieces of steel consistent with Type 28 submarine plating, but with serial markings that did not correspond to any known lost U-boat. Although the findings were initially publicized, they were quickly suppressed under NATO classification. In the German Federal Archives, requests for access to files on Operation Seawolf often return the response: no records located. The WWII. Persistence of redacted gaps, however, suggests deliberate removal rather than non-existence. The fate of the Seawolf II convoy remains one of the unsolved maritime mysteries of the 20th century. Did 6 of the Reich's most advanced submarines vanish beneath the waves without trace, as Allied reports suggest? Or did they slip through the collapsing Atlantic defense net, delivering cargo of immense strategic value to a neutral shore? The silence of both Allied and Axis records, punctuated only by fragmentary whispers in intelligence cables, suggests a truth too sensitive to acknowledge publicly. Whether the convoy carried uranium, radar prototypes, or men whose identities would compromise post-war alliances, the disappearance of Seawolf II represents not merely the chaos of the war's final days, but the calculated burial of history itself. The official history of Operation Paperclip presents a pragmatic narrative. The United States, facing the onset of the Cold War, transferred hundreds of German scientists to American soil in 1945 and 1946. Their expertise, particularly in rocketry and aeronautics, propelled US advances from V-2 testbeds at White Sands to the Apollo missions. Yet buried in the archives are references to documents that suggest a darker dimension. Files that appear briefly in catalogues and then vanish, leaving only faint traces in memoranda and redacted correspondence. These became known among a small circle of intelligence officers as the Schattenfeuer Papers. The trail begins in Bavaria in May 1945, when the US Army's 44th Infantry Division swept into the region around Augsburg. Among the seizures, catalogued by the Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee, were crates of documents labeled with Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA, seals, bound in black leather folders, and indexed under project codes beginning with SF. A US Army G2 inventory, form dated 17 May 1945, describes their contents as technical research, munitions control, experimentation records. Within days, the inventory sheets were amended by hand, entries crossed out, substituted with vague phrases such as miscellaneous. By the time the material reached Heidelberg for review, the references to Schattenfeuer had disappeared. One of the few surviving accounts comes from CIC officer Walter Jessup, whose 1947 deposition to the Senate War Investigating Committee, filed under restricted annex, described encountering transcripts of human testing related to remote detonation apparatus. Jessup recalled diagrams showing a crude form of radio-controlled explosive charge, alongside testimony that prisoners at Gusen II concentration camp had been used to test blast effects in subterranean chambers. The papers were disturbing in their precision, Jessup said. I was instructed that they would be forwarded to Wright Field, but I never saw them again. His testimony was struck from the public record. The annex remains sealed. The suspicion that these files were deliberately suppressed grows stronger when examining anomalies in the Paperclip transfer lists. Declassified in the 1990s, these rosters reveal the names of engineers and physicians recruited despite direct involvement with SS units. Yet side-by-side comparison with earlier drafts, preserved in microfilm at the National Archives, shows several names removed at the last minute, only to reappear, altered, on later immigration documents. One example is an SS Sturmbannführer, Listed as Dr. Heinrich Voss, connected with chemical weapons trials in Poland. In later US immigration files, his name appears as Hans Vossler, employed at Fort Detrick under a contract beginning 1947. No trial, no denazification proceedings, and no mention in Nuremberg transcripts. Intelligence correspondence of the period offers chilling corroboration. A July 1946 memo from General Lucius Clay's headquarters in Frankfurt, tagged under restricted distribution, warns of potential embarrassment if Schattenfeuer dossiers were made public. The memo recommends integration of select technical data into Ordnance R&D, with personnel shielded by paperclip channels. Cross-referencing reveals that the same week, 3 German engineers arrived in the US under assumed identities, entering through Project 63, a sub-channel of paperclip designed to obscure personnel histories from both the press and Congress. The Soviet Union was not ignorant of these transfers. A captured NKVD interrogation transcript from 1947, preserved in CIA archives under FOIA release in 2003, records a German scientist's claim that the Americans have the fire of shadows now. Soviet analysts interpreted this as evidence that the US had acquired not only V2 expertise, but advanced triggering mechanisms for nuclear weapons delivery. The USSR's rapid development of its own remote detonation devices in the early 1950s lends weight to the possibility that both superpowers drew from the same tainted source material. The erasure of the Schattenfeuer files became near total after 1950. When the Army's Office of the Chief of Military History began compiling its multi-volume official record of the occupation of Germany, no reference to the program appeared. Index cards in Heidelberg referencing the SF series were destroyed under routine weeding procedures, leaving only a handful of misfiled carbon copies in unrelated folders. Requests for these materials in the 1960s were met with standard replies. Documents not located. Yet in 1977, a Freedom of Information request uncovered a memorandum from the Pentagon's Research and Engineering Directorate acknowledging custody of experimental files of German origin, transferred 1947, destroyed 1959. The memorandum itself was heavily censored, but the language bore a striking resemblance to earlier descriptions of Schattenfeuer. Even within the intelligence community, whispers persisted. A retired OSS officer, speaking under anonymity in a 1981 oral history project, recalled a briefing in which we were told to keep our mouths shut about the camp trials because we needed the data more than we needed justice. His recollection aligns with broader patterns of omission. Nuremberg's doctors' trial excluded entire categories of experiments on explosives, despite ample documentation that they had occurred. The silence may not have been accidental, but the direct result of the file's disappearance into classified US military research. The human cost remains unacknowledged. Survivor accounts from Gusen II, archived at Yad Vashem and the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, include testimony of prisoners taken into tunnels and never seen again. In one case, a Czech prisoner described being forced to wire strange metal boxes before guards evacuated the chamber. The detonation that followed collapsed. The tunnel. The survivors who dug it out recalled body parts scattered among the rubble. None of these testimonies were included in official war crimes indictments. When asked why, investigators at the time cited insufficient corroboration. Yet internal memos show that US prosecutors had in fact received relevant documentation, only for it to vanish from their case files. The ghost files of Operation Paperclip remain an open wound in the historical record. Their disappearance is not merely a bureaucratic accident, but a conscious act of erasure, a choice to prioritize strategic advantage over accountability. What knowledge was salvaged from the shadows? Radio-triggered munitions, biological dispersal, techniques, human endurance data became woven into the fabric of US military research, stripped of its origins. What remains for the historian is the silence of missing pages, the faint outline of file numbers crossed out, and the testimony of men like Jessup, who saw enough to know that something had been buried too deep. The legacy of Schattenfeuer is not found in open libraries or public archives, but in the classified vaults where the United States stored its most dangerous acquisitions from a defeated Reich. files locked away, not because they lacked importance, but because their revelation would have stained the post-war order beyond repair. On the night of 29th of September 1957, a violent explosion tore through the Mayak nuclear complex near the industrial town of Kyshtym in the Soviet Union's Chelyabinsk Oblast. The event, later classified as one of the most severe nuclear accidents in history, was concealed by Moscow for decades. Officially, the catastrophe was attributed to the failure of a cooling system in a high-level waste storage tank. But in the shadows of Cold War intelligence archives, another story emerges, one that connects the disaster to the unacknowledged transfer of German wartime nuclear research eastward after 1945. At the heart of this alternate account are fragmentary CIA situation reports from late 1957, declassified in part during the 1990s. Report number SR 57214, dated 12th October 1957, records unconfirmed indications that recent radiological release near Chelyabinsk has isotopic profile inconsistent with standard plutonium byproducts. The report notes traces of uranium-233, a rare isotope associated with thorium breeding cycles, which match samples recovered in 1945 from abandoned Wehrmacht laboratories in Silesia. How such material found its way into a Soviet reactor remained unexplained. Later annotations in the file, handwritten and heavily redacted, mention German component transfers, Mayak 1946. The Soviet secrecy surrounding the Mayak disaster was unprecedented even by Cold War standards. Entire villages in the Teka River basin were evacuated without warning, their populations dispersed into distant settlements under NKVD supervision. Medical records of radiation sickness were sequestered in closed special folders, accessible only to the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the agency responsible for nuclear development. Yet whispers escaped through émigré channels. In 1958, defectors in Vienna described German engineers missing since 1946, presumed dead in accident. Their names do not appear in official Soviet rosters. Cross-referencing US Army Counterintelligence Corps prisoner transfers from occupied Germany shows that at least 12 scientists disappeared after being taken into Soviet custody. Among them, Dr. Wilhelm Kahl, formerly of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. Kahl's case is particularly notable. In OSS captured records, a folder marked Karl W. Uranium Metallurgy describes his experiments with thorium fuel cycles in Breslau in early 1945. The file notes the discovery of a notebook, half-burned, which contained schematics for a reactor distinct from Heisenberg's Higelac design. After the war, the Americans assumed Karl had perished during the Soviet advance, but a Soviet internal memorandum intercepted by British intelligence in 1947 speaks of Dr. K to be transferred to plant number 817, the cover designation for Mayak. From then, all traces vanish. The CIA's Project Vesta, a compartmentalized program running from 1956 to 1962, focused specifically on nuclear signatures detected by high-altitude U-2 reconnaissance. Flight logs from September 1957, released under FOIA in 2010, record abnormally high radiation plumes drifting eastward from the Urals. Analysts noted isotopic ratios inconsistent with American or British reactors, and a draft assessment hypothesized Soviet experimentation with hybrid reactor cycles utilizing captured German theoretical data. The draft was withdrawn within a month, replaced by a sanitized version attributing the plume to routine waste venting. Only the excised draft, retained in the personal papers of analyst Harold B. Chase, suggests that US intelligence connected the Mayak accident to remnants of the Reich's abandoned atomic effort. Civilian testimony from the region, gathered clandestinely by dissident Soviet scientists in the 1960s, paints a grim picture. Residents described seeing foreign men in lab coats, speaking German, working under armed guard within the Mayak perimeter. One villager recalled a convoy of trucks in 1946, escorted by NKVD troops, carrying crates stenciled with Gothic script. Survivors of the evacuation reported being told never to mention the German experts again. under penalty of imprisonment. These accounts align with NKVD directives preserved in Moscow's archives, which order foreign specialists to be erased from personnel rosters after 1948. Western historians have long debated the scale and seriousness of German nuclear research. Conventional wisdom asserts that the Reich lagged far behind Allied efforts, hindered by shortages of material and internal rivalries. Yet the fragmentary evidence from Mayak implies that German theorists may have pursued unconventional reactor designs, which the Soviets inherited in raw, incomplete form. If true, it would explain why the Mayak waste tanks contained isotopes not normally associated with Soviet production methods, experimental byproducts from reactors built using German concepts that were never fully understood even by their operators. The blackout following the disaster was total. Soviet state security forbade mention of the explosion in the press, while affected regions were simply erased from maps. Western intelligence noted unexplained quarantines across 20,000 square kilometers, euphemistically labeled as restricted forest zones. When CIA officers attempted to brief the Atomic Energy Commission, transcripts show that higher authorities ordered silence. One 1958 margin note scrawled by Alan Dulles himself reads, "No advantage to pursue German angle buried files." It appears that Washington, like Moscow, chose erasure over disclosure. Yet faint echoes persist in the historical record. In 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian journalist Zhoris Medvedev gained access to survivors who spoke openly for the first time. Among their testimonies was the claim that the Germans died in the fire, referring to an underground facility consumed by the explosion. No names, no graves, and no official acknowledgement followed. The Russian Nuclear Authority dismissed such accounts as rumor. But declassified CIA memoranda from the same year mention renewed interest in Karl file discrepancies. The Kyshtym Blackout remains not just a nuclear tragedy, but a historical riddle, a disaster whose shadow falls across both Nazi Germany's twilight experiments and the Soviet Union's ruthless pursuit of supremacy. The missing scientists, the vanished files, the isotopic signatures that did not belong, all suggest that the world's nuclear age was shaped not solely by Manhattan Project triumphs or Soviet espionage, but by fragments of research smuggled from collapsing laboratories in Silesia, carried east by victors determined to weaponize every scrap of knowledge, no matter its human cost. In the silence that followed, entire communities were erased, and with them, the final trace of those who had been forced into the Soviet nuclear program, their existence buried beneath layers of secrecy, radiation, and the frozen archives of a Cold War that left no room for acknowledgement of the dead. In June 1942, the Mediterranean became the stage for one of the fiercest supply battles of the Second World War. Operation Harpoon was a British attempt to deliver desperately needed fuel, ammunition, and food to the besieged island of Malta. 6 merchant ships, escorted by a powerful Royal Navy force, sailed from Gibraltar, while a parallel convoy, Operation Vigorous, departed Alexandria. Both were savaged by Axis naval and air attacks. The official record describes heavy losses and partial success, but hidden within fragmentary Italian naval logs and post-war intelligence intercepts lies a darker episode, one that suggests a detachment of British commandos was captured alive, transported to a clandestine holding site, and systematically erased from the historical record. The earliest indication appears in the diary of Capitano di Fregata Mario Falangola, commander of the submarine Bronzo. In an entry dated 16th of June 1942, the day after Harpoon's convoy clashed with Italian surface forces off Pantelleria, Falangola notes receiving coded orders to recover carico speciale from small craft, transfer to Pantelleria. Allied records make no mention of commandos operating in the area, but Italian dispatches speak cryptically of nemici vestiti in uniform inglese, catturati in mare, enemies dressed in English uniform, captured at sea. These men, if they existed, do not appear on any British casualty lists from the operation. Pantelleria, a heavily fortified island between Sicily and Tunisia, housed not only anti-aircraft batteries, but also underground storage tunnels originally excavated by Italian engineers. Post-war Allied surveys catalogued the island's defences in detail, yet an entire sector of subterranean chambers, designated Zona R, is absent from published schematics. Italian naval correspondence from June 1942, preserved in the Archivio Centrale dello Stato, mentions Custodia dei prigionieri Harpoon under Black Shirt Guard in Zona R. The documents stop abruptly after July, replaced with routine garrison reports that make no further reference to prisoners. A partial explanation emerges from a decrypted MI6 intercept dated 3rd of August 1942, which refers to the Pantelleria men. The cable, directed to the Cairo station, instructs that no further action is to be taken, subject to policy decision at London. Why would British intelligence acknowledge captives but order silence? One possibility is that the commandos were part of an unrecorded Special Air Service or small-scale raiding force detachment. Inquiries into SAS war diaries reveal a curious gap. Between May and July 1942, one troop's activities are described only as Operational Preparation, Mediterranean. Subsequent pages are missing, torn from the logbook before its deposit in the National Archives. The question of their fate deepens with the testimony of an Italian officer interrogated in 1944. Lieutenant Paolo Gentile, captured in Sicily, told Allied examiners that a group of Inglesi were kept in Pantelleria tunnels until 1943, then evacuated by submarine to the mainland. His statement was filed under unverified and buried in CIC annexes. Yet German U-boat logs for September 1942 contain a brief entry from U-559, noting rendezvous with an Italian submarine carrying special prisoners off Naples. The notation is unique in its phrasing, and no prisoners were ever formally registered. The trail goes cold until after the war, when FOIA releases in 1968 revealed a memorandum circulated within MI6 titled Disposition of Pantelleria Captives. The document, heavily redacted, concludes, subject individuals presumed deceased, disclosure inadvisable due to operational security. The use of the present tense presumed decades after the fact suggests uncertainty, not confirmation. Researchers who pressed for access to supporting files were told the material had been destroyed in a 1951 fire at Government Communications Headquarters. Families of missing commandos may have lived their lives unaware of this hidden history. Commonwealth War Graves Commission records list several men as lost at sea, Operation Harpoon, their names etched on the Malta Memorial. But casualty reports filed in 1942 list them initially as missing, only amended months later, to presumed dead. The delay is consistent with bureaucracies awaiting intelligence confirmation that may never have come. Among the names is Sergeant John K. Milburn, formerly of No. 62 Commando, whose personnel file contains a final notation in unfamiliar handwriting, transfer Pantelleria, no follow-up exists. The Pantelleria tunnels themselves offer only silence. When the Allies captured the island in June 1943, after a massive bombardment, engineers documented collapsed chambers filled with rubble and burnt timbers. Official reports attributed the destruction to aerial bombing. Yet photographs held in the Imperial War Museum show steel doors welded shut, untouched by blast damage. What lay beyond those sealed portals remains unknown, as excavation was deemed unnecessary in the rush to prepare the island for invasion staging. Speculation persists that the prisoners were executed prior to the island's fall, their remains entombed in the tunnels. Others argue they were shipped to mainland Italy and disappeared into the chaos of 1943. No Red Cross visitation records exist, and no war crimes trials address their disappearance. The silence may have been deliberate. Public acknowledgement would have revealed clandestine Allied operations in Axis territory at a time when secrecy was paramount. Moreover, if the men were indeed members of unacknowledged special units, their capture could have compromised wider intelligence networks. The erasure was meticulous. By 1945, neither British nor Italian files referenced the prisoners. Requests by relatives for information were met with form replies citing losses at sea. Italian officers who might have known more fell silent under post-war amnesties. The only surviving clues remain scattered. A torn SAS logbook, an Italian naval diary, a cryptic MI6 intercept, and the whispered phrase, "the Pantelleria men." These fragments hint at a suppressed chapter in the Mediterranean War, where captured commandos were written out of existence for reasons still obscured by classified files. The forgotten prisoners of Operation Harpoon remind us that war leaves not only graves and monuments, but also voids in the record, voids carefully crafted by those who judged that silence served strategy better than truth. Their names survive only in memorial stone and in the faint traces of documents never meant to see the light. A ghost battalion buried beneath the politics of wartime secrecy and post-war convenience. In September 1945, 4 months after the German surrender, a Norwegian whaling ship approached Nordaustlandet, a desolate island within the Svalbard archipelago. On board the vessel were men tasked with accepting the surrender of one of the last active German units of the Second World War, the weather station Haudegen. Operated by the Kriegsmarine since 1944, the outpost had continued transmitting meteorological reports to U-boat command long after Berlin had fallen. The surrender itself is a matter of record, but the story of what the men left behind, the sealed steel containers buried in the permafrost, remains largely absent from official histories. Haudegen was established in September 1944 under the command of Dr. Wilhelm Deege, a geographer pressed into military service. Supplied by U-307 and the supply ship Carl J. Busch, the team constructed prefabricated huts on Nordaustlandet's bleak coast. Their mission was to provide daily meteorological data crucial for U-boat and Luftwaffe operations in the Arctic. But Norwegian archives reveal that the station was not limited to weather duties. Notes from a 1953 Foreign Ministry meeting, unearthed in the 1990s, mention sealed canisters removed from Haudegen by NATO authorities, contents not disclosed. The phrasing suggests the station served as more than a meteorological outpost. The first hint of mystery arises in Deege's own surrender report. Preserved in the Bundesarchiv, the document lists sealed records, left buried due to logistical constraints. Yet his wording is unusually vague, avoiding specific inventory details. A Norwegian Navy officer present at the surrender, Lieutenant Sigurd Rød, later recalled that the Germans were insistent about the recovery of scientific material they had cached underground. When Allied forces returned to the site in 1946, they reportedly excavated several steel containers, which were immediately transferred to Oslo under armed guard. From there, their fate disappears into classified NATO documentation. What might have been inside these caches? One clue comes from a set of partially declassified German signals, decrypted post-war by Bletchley Park, but filed away under miscellaneous, meteorological. A March 1945 transmission refers to M-Gerät and E-Gerät equipment, terms that normally describe magnetic detection and electronic countermeasure devices. Such technology had little to do with Arctic weather, but would have been of immense interest to both Allied and Soviet intelligence. If prototypes were indeed buried at Haudegen, their retrieval could explain why NATO restricted access to Svalbard archives during the early Cold War. In 1955, a classified Norwegian defense memorandum recorded that one container from Haudegen remains unaccounted for, presumed not recovered. The memorandum was marked, "Do not circulate outside NATO channels." That same year, US Air Force, Project Grudge, an atmospheric and geomagnetic monitoring program, logged unexplained anomalies in magnetic readings near Svalbard. While officially attributed to solar activity, the coincidence with Haudegen's unrecovered container has fueled speculation that the missing cache contained experimental geomagnetic sensors intended for submarine detection. Eyewitness testimony adds further layers. In 1980, former Haudegen radio operator Georg Ritter gave an interview to a German documentary team. Though most of his recollections focused on isolation and survival, he made a brief cryptic remark. "We were told that some of our instruments must never fall into Russian hands. They were not weather instruments." Ritter refused to elaborate further, citing post-war oaths of secrecy he claimed were enforced even after captivity. His statement, dismissed at the time as embellishment, aligns uncomfortably with NATO's classified handling of Haudegen material. Soviet interest in the Arctic station was intense. Declassified KGB files describe surveillance of Norwegian expeditions to Nordaustlandet in the 1950s, with particular focus on buried German installations. A 1961 report from Murmansk Naval Intelligence mentions evidence of foreign retrieval of meteorological archives and equipment with potential military application. The Soviet Union had every reason to fear NATO's possession of advanced detection technology, especially during the escalating submarine arms race beneath the polar ice. The final piece of the puzzle comes from a 1978 Norwegian geological survey expedition, which stumbled upon corroded steel fragments protruding from the permafrost near the original Haudegen site. Analysis indicated mid-20th century German manufacture, with traces of lead shielding and degraded paper fragments bearing Enigma-style cipher groups. The discovery was quietly handed over to the Norwegian armed forces, and the site was resealed. Public statements described the material as ordinary refuse. Researchers requesting access to the recovered fragments were denied on grounds of national security. Why would meteorological records from 1945 remain a national security issue 3 decades later? The answer may lie in the blurred line between weather research and military science. Accurate Arctic forecasts were vital for naval operations, but they also provided cover for testing instruments of broader strategic significance. If Haudegen's caches contained prototype magnetic anomaly detectors, experimental Enigma records, or even data on high-frequency transmission under polar conditions, their recovery could have shaped NATO's Cold War surveillance capabilities. The Arctic Vault of Station Haudegen endures as one of the war's quieter enigmas. Officially, it was the last German unit to surrender, a scientific outpost abandoned in the ice. Unofficially, it may have been a repository for technology the Reich sought to hide from capture, preserved in steel containers and entrusted to a frozen wilderness. Some of those containers were retrieved, spirited into classified archives. At least one was never found. Whether it still lies entombed beneath the shifting permafrost of Nordaustlandet, its contents corroding in silence, remains unanswered. What is clear is that the surrender of Station Haudegen did not end with a handshake on a whaling ship's deck. It left behind questions buried as deep as the Arctic ice itself, questions that neither NATO nor the Soviet Union ever wished to see fully uncovered. The deeper we search, the darker the void becomes, as if history itself has conspired to conceal what was never meant to be unearthed. Behind every redacted page, every vanished convoy, every erased name lies a secret, not destroyed, but entombed, waiting. The question is not whether these shadows existed, but whether their echoes can ever be silenced. Some truths were buried for a reason, and when uncovered, they may ask more of us than we can bear.